Welcome back, everybody. My name is Matthew McQuilla, and I am back with Professor Larry Catá. Today, we were discussing his book once again, Hong Kong Between One Country and Two Systems, Chapter 18, Students at the Center of the University and the University Response, written Sunday, October 20th, 2019. How are you doing, Professor Backer?
Well, just fine. Thank you very much. And thank you for continuing to serve as the host provocateur of these conversations. I really appreciate it.
Well, you're welcome. And thank you for letting me be a part of this with you. I guess we should start off, this chapter really talked about students, and given the time, I mean, it's the end of August and we're back to school now. So I guess that raises the significance of this chapter. So what's the picture behind you, and does that have anything to do with the chapter today?
No, this is, these were the last set of pictures I took before I left Hong Kong in June, but it sort of evokes a little bit of the sense of what is going on. This is now the middle of October, empty streets, people are, there's things are both congealing. The police are in the background, photographers here, and then the protesters and the local authorities off to the side. So it's probably it's a bad effort to evoke the sense of what is going on in this essay. It's been a while since I had written. Things had been changing, but from my perspective and the perspective of the book, where I'm looking at discursive changes, that is, changes in rhetoric and position and the development of the ideas and the meaning behind the actions, things remain relatively stable as people kind of filled in their positions. And then this comes along, and here, there's a great point for congealing. And like you said, school had started. The trajectories that I've been writing about in August and especially in September, now all of a sudden you really see it, and you see it discursively. And again, that's the moment when it made sense for me to look at it again. And that's what this chapter is really about. And it focuses on an incredibly important nexus point. One, the repercussions of which is still being felt, not just in China, not just in Hong Kong, but in China as well. We have here a meeting point at the university of the intelligentsia, the faculty administration of Hong Kong's universities, all of them incredibly influential and really well embedded in global discourses and in the global academic culture. You have students, you have the local authorities, you have the national authorities and the international community, and it all kind of congeals here discursively. The congealing occurs, and what I use as the takeoff for my my effort to elaborate is an open letter, which was widely circulated at the time and discussed, was the open letter circulated by the Chinese University of Hong Kong Vice-Chancellor and Professor Tuan, which for me nicely captured what was going on here, and also provided a little bit of a sense of where things were going. Students remained deeply a centering element in the protests. Their tactics had become more interesting. There'd been a refining of the use of lawfare, of the discursive notions of violence, who is being violent, and therefore who is the legitimate holder of force in the discourse, a bunch of those things. The central authorities increasingly concerned about, as they had been since June, about the role of students in education, and all of this congeals here.
So the universities, do you think that they played a role as a protector for many of the students that took part in this discourse and keeping them from being seen as the foreign? or did they only accelerate those thoughts by many people within the mainland or within the central government?
Okay, and again, it's to some extent, even though this book is very long, when we discuss this stuff, there's always a simplification that belies the reality. So
yeah.
We talked about this. When you talk about the protesters, it's not a single thing, it's a constellation. When you talk about Hong Kong and Hong Kong authorities, you've got you got the local authorities, but you've got fracture within them. When you talk about the central authorities, again, it's the same thing. And so we use the kind of reductionism as a handy way of capturing the essence of particular leading forces at the time and in the place that we're talking about it, but always keeping in mind that these things are actually more complicated and that things are moving in different and sometimes in completely incompatible directions. And it's important to keep that in mind as you work through the discourse. And again, my object in writing this is not to give the definitive history of the protest, but rather to provide a definitive, now who knows, you all can be the judge of that, but at least to attempt to be more definite in defining the discursive frameworks, its genesis, its development, and its deployment, right, during the course of what occurs between the beginning of June 2019 and 2020. And so that's where I'm focusing. And to some extent, that necessarily requires both a little bit of essentialization. I'm essentializing the positions, looking at its essence, but also reductionism. I'm reducing a large and very subtle complexity into something because I'm focusing on a particular set of actors. And so that's a long way around to the question, well, the university, yeah, like universities in the US, you got a little bit of everything in it. The question is, when we make meaning of the university and its role, especially its discursive role in this context, what is it? How is meaning to be made? Because meaning is, of course, the ultimate act of essentializing and reducing objects by giving it a particular signification, which is to some extent more reflective of the sense and approach of the person who's giving the meaning than what actually may be going on inside. So a lot of times, and for those of you who kind of understand what I'm saying, let me just be explicit. This is my little side venture into semiotics. The notion here is if you look at the university as an object, you realize that it's a bunch of sub-objects, but the question is, from an outsider looking in, for example, the central authorities or the local authorities, there may be a discursive and a discursively powerful effort to make meaning, to use the university as an object, as a reduced object that can be signified in a particular way, a very reductionist way, towards the ends of moving that object within and the particular objectives of the person who's giving meaning. So when we're looking at the university, looking at answering your question at last, right, we are from the outside, the university is going to look a particular way, and that's really the essence of the essay. The central authorities are essentially going to see the university as the problem, as a singular problem. And they're going to parse out who are the troublemakers who create the problem. The local authorities view it as a problem of a different sort. Inside the university, you're viewing them, they may be viewing themselves in a very different way. And that's the point of the open letter, because in a sense, the university and its intelligentsia at its best viewed themselves as a bridge outward to the mainland, a bridge outward to the global community and discourse, a bridge outward to the local authorities, and more importantly, a bridge outward to the faculty and students in their various, the constellations of actions from very pro-Beijing to independent oriented, a bridge to all of the students as well. And this letter represents a way of trying to capture that positionality as a nexus point in ways that we're going to see by the time we get to May of the year after just falls flat. But it's also, but that in the process of becoming that nexus point, it also illuminates both the way in which the central authorities begin to view or harden their view, in a sense, of the university as full of intellectual troublemakers who corrupt the minds of students so that they are no longer patriotic and therefore either are corrupted, right, into becoming unwitting or witting tools of the foreign, right, or who are otherwise in need of correction, while the university itself views its role as as the space where the essence of the internationalist vision of Hong Kong and its international intellectual traditions can be refined and then sent out for the discussions, the political discussions that are supposed to be had.
Yeah, I mean, when I look at that letter by the Vice Chancellor, I would think that maybe as a central government, or if I was leadership within the central government, I don't want to reduce it, but I would feel threatened by them being the nexus point and me assuming the power that they have from reading that letter, if I recognize what I was reading.
Well, yes, exactly right. And at the time, I think that wasn't certainly that wasn't the way it was intended. But it also exposes the kind of sensibilities within the academy that knowingly or unknowingly could trigger a response. You've hit it on the head. The response you're going to get from the central and local authorities, which makes perfect sense from their perspective, but with respect to which the people write the letter might either have been oblivious to, or the letter becomes subtly provocative.
Okay.
And it's not clear. For my purposes in writing this, it didn't matter. What was important was indeed the discursive bullets, and there are a number of them, if I can, that are worth repeating here and that are worth looking at. It was interesting that and some of this mirrors, by the way, sensibilities in American and European universities as well, especially in times of protest. So there were 4 or 5 things that really struck me. The first was the assertion by the university of its core or primary responsibility for the well-being of its students during the course of the protest, right? And it did this without denying the ultimate, but now secondary rights of the state and the state authorities to maintain order and civil peace, but at the same time, it projected itself discursively as an institutional barrier, right, of first instance between the students and their actions, their quest for whatever truth and whatever activities that they're doing, interposing them between the students and the state, which is something that would not have sounded very unusual, for example, in the American context, but certainly from the context of the central authority sounds a little, would have been eyebrow raising. The second one was that the sense of having interposed itself this way, the university's recharacterization of itself essentially as a Western style human rights defender, that these are students, that they were going to serve both as parents patriae, but as parents patriae defending them with respect to international human rights norms, rather than with respect to the behavior norms embedded in law either in law on the mainland or in law in Hong Kong. And so you've got here the university importing the sensibilities, a very new and still very controversial to some extent in the West outside of the UN structures in Geneva and the ideologies of the great human rights NGOs in the West. This notion of the particular role and the particular deference that must be accorded human rights defenders in the context of protecting individual liberties. And the third was that the university itself was viewed as kind of a sub-administrative unit, that it uses its own networks to provide resources for students who seek to complain against breaches of authority by the state, that the university is not just a human rights defender, but can itself then advance the position of the students that in fact it is the violence of the state rather than the violence of the students that are the disruptive and the delegitimating forces, and that at the same time, that as a human rights defender and as a protector of its student stakeholders, the university had a duty to intervene directly with the highest level of state authorities to ensure that rule of law mechanisms and state authorities have imposed, that what they had imposed on themselves were also being implemented. So all of a sudden, not only are they human rights defenders, but they're also defenders of the rule of law in Hong Kong. So this becomes a very ambitious discursive document, and coming fairly soon after the wide, and by wide I mean the global dispersion of the 5 demands, all of a sudden this changes in a very dramatic way the discursive tenor of what's going on here, right? And remember, and it pays, we're now in October, to remember how all of this starts in June, the extradition law. Now we are in a much deeper conversation, and one which at this point, near the end of October, involves discursively the position and role of the university, not just as a political actor, but as a human rights actor as well. And that, in a sense, is fairly extraordinary, and one that the central authorities, given what they've been saying in June, starting in June, would probably not take kindly to.
You know, when I read this, and this will probably be the final point that I make, I kind of saw this as the last stopgap, like the last chance for turnaround, for there to be some type of mediation. I don't know if you had already given up hope at that point in time, but this was the point where I said the central authorities and the universities have an opportunity to play mediator. Well, really the universities have a chance to play mediator, and the central authorities were more threatened by the messages coming out of the university than they were willing to, I guess you would say, accept that role of power that the universities would hold.
Right, and all right, in retrospect, it's clear that by this point, it's too late. In the middle of October of 2019, I recall my sense is, well, wow, okay, this is interesting and powerful. It nicely embellishes not just the sensibilities, but discursively, it embellishes the internationalist position, which is now growing and really taking shape starting at the end of August through mid-October, this internationalist position, which is now being taken up by international actors as well as by universities as a kind of locally embedded international actor, as against the position that had been earlier developed and then deepened by the central and local authorities since June. But I said, okay, now these positions at both ends of the spectrum by the end of October are now fleshed out enough so that they may be equivalent enough that this can provide a basis for sort of meeting, not necessarily in the middle, but somewhere other than at either one of the extremes, and it was still possible to do that. The problem is that by this point already, so many actors have taken so many discursive positions, both by words and by actions, especially the protesters, that one began to sense that compromise where everyone can go and have a drink afterwards and say, yeah, it was rough, but we're still friends, was becoming more and more elusive. The incursions into the university, the exuberance, I use that term very loosely, of the students and the protesters, and the more well-developed and increasingly self-reflexively incompatible positions of the sides made it clearer, in a sense, what had to occur to develop a compromise, but also clearly suggested that the more these things develop, the less likely it was going to be that there was going to be compromise. And indeed, from the perspective of the central authorities, even at the time, I thought, well, this is beginning to, if the central authorities needed any kind of proof that their gut feeling about out of control intellectuals in Hong Kong and their ability not just to corrupt students, but then to throw them out on the street, to deploy them on the street. Whether this is true or not, it doesn't matter. But in a discursive sense, it appears to be true. From the central authorities' perspective, this is confirmation, and it would, given this, come as no surprise a year later and 2 years later that some of the qualms that had already been expressed by the central authorities, Xi Jinping had been talking about educational reform in the mainland, certainly since 2018, in a series of in retrospect, very important speeches. It would not be surprising that sensibility for the need for control, political control of education, normative control of education, and normative control of the way in which the dispersers of knowledge, the intelligentsia, actually conveyed this knowledge appropriately to the students. It is no surprise that this is now going to come to the forefront. And indeed, one begins to see this certainly by 2020 in Hong Kong, and one continues to see its repercussions in educational policy in China all the way through this year. The recent reevaluation of foreign partnerships, and I think it was something close to 300 foreign partnerships were reviewed and canceled. The focus by the central authorities on the quality and direction of education and the soundness of legitimate education criteria and education delivery has only picked up speed, and it is likely that will wash up into Hong Kong as well. But we begin to see, in a sense, from the central authorities' perspective, why this becomes important and why the universities, in terms of the protection of their view of the integrity of the one country, two systems rule, right, becomes threatened in a very discursively important way from the university, the great producer, the great cauldron of the discourse that could challenge and potentially successfully challenge the one country centering discourse of the central authorities. And as the universities begin to align with the discourse of the international community, and especially not just the international community, but leading states within the international community, this becomes a greater problem. We'll talk about, again, foreshadowing, and I know our time is almost up. Foreshadowing, this it connects the dots between what we'd already seen in a fairly loose way, talking about the patriotic front earlier, to something like discursive state policy bringing back Mao Zedong's notions of the differences between patriots and threats in terms of citizenship and rights, democracy for the patriots, dictatorship for threats. It brings that back. But we won't see that again, foreshadowing, we won't see that again until the next year.
Wow. That sounds like it summarized pretty much the whole chapter. So I feel like we've gotten everything out of this. We squeezed the lemon and made lemonade.
No, but there's still a lot of good stuff in the chapter. So y'all buy the book and read the chapter.
Yes, there are. And I hope we left some questions unanswered, and you can reach out to Professor Backer or myself to get them answered, or you can read the book and try to, be a student and answer them yourselves. But thank you again for speaking with me today.
Oh, it's my pleasure. The book costs less than a nice home cooked meal at a restaurant. So go out, open your wallets and buy the book.
No one uses wallets anymore. All right. I'm just playing. Okay, well, thank you for being out here with me, and thank you all for listening.
All right. I really appreciate this.